crime with no evidence, a murder with no victim. Hercule Poirot faces one of the most mind-bending cases of his career. Can you spot the hidden clue before he does? The small, secluded village of Belvoir Hollow sat nestled at the foot of the mist-covered hills, a forgotten corner of the world where time seemed to have slowed, the modern rush of life left at the village's edge. A gathering was taking place at the old, ivy-clad manor, a house that had long held secrets within its walls. The windows gleamed with a soft amber light, casting long shadows onto the cobblestone path leading to the front door. A cozy, idyllic scene, but something hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. The evening itself had begun with an almost nostalgic quality. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of crisp evening that invited a feeling of contentment. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, the smoke curling upward into the dusky sky, carrying with it the scent of burning pine. Inside, guests milled about, their voices light, their laughter gentle. At first, the atmosphere seemed perfectly calm, like any quiet gathering in a village retreat. Yet, as the hours passed, that calm began to fray at the edges, leaving behind an uncomfortable feeling that no one dared name. Poirot sat near the window, a glass of sherry resting delicately in his hand, his keen eyes scanning the room, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his features. The guests were polite, friendly even, but Poirot felt it in his bones, the unease. It crept through the room like a shadow, subtle at first, but soon enough it made itself known. The sound of a door creaking open, the sound of an unsteady footstep, the laughter that fell too abruptly into silence, all these small moments spoke volumes to Poirot's trained mind. The mannerisms, the carefully measured tones of voice, the way certain glances were cast, all hinted at something lurking beneath the surface. Edward, a man in his 40s, was not quite what he appeared to be. On the outside, he wore the mask of a mild-mannered, affable gentleman, but there was an air about him that Poirot could not place, a restlessness that had little to do with his surroundings. The way his eyes darted about the room, never quite settling on anyone for too long, and the tightness in his jaw whenever O'Rourke, the man with whom he shared a history, entered the conversation. O'Rourke was a man of presence, the kind of man who never went unnoticed, even when he wasn't speaking. He exuded a quiet confidence, but Poirot observed how he and Edward shared a strange and palpable tension. Their small exchanges were charged, as though their very words were carefully measured, their meanings buried under layers of resentment and regret. Their past, Poirot suspected, was more complicated than they let on. Their conflict, the unspoken history that hovered between them, created a nearly physical strain in the room, felt by everyone but spoken of by no one. The night wore on, and Poirot noticed something else, the presence of the wasps. The creatures, not common for the season, had begun to hover near the open window, their low hum interrupting the quiet moments of conversation. The wasp's nest, discovered only hours before, had been casually dismissed by the others as nothing more than an inconvenience, a nuisance even. But to Poirot, the nest became a symbol, something threatening, something hidden, much like the conflict between Edward and O'Rourke. The nest, so ordinary, and yet so charged with danger, stood as a reminder that things in this house were not as they seemed. And then, just as the guests began to settle into the false sense of normalcy that often follows a long day's gathering, the air shifted. The doorbell rang, unexpectedly, like a sudden disruption in an otherwise peaceful landscape. All eyes turned to the door, but Poirot's gaze never wavered from Edward and O'Rourke. There was something about the tension in their bodies, the way their eyes met in silence. It felt as though they were waiting for something to happen. Poirot's mind, sharp and methodical, began to piece together the small details. The unspoken, the half-hidden glances, the tightness in the air. He could almost feel the storm brewing, a storm that would break with the force of an inevitable conclusion. A loud crash broke the momentary stillness, and suddenly O'Rourke was found dead, crumpled on the floor near the window. His face, once full of life, now frozen in an expression of shock and disbelief. The room fell silent, the guests too stunned to speak. Edward's hand, still outstretched as if he had been reaching for something or someone was the only movement in the room. Poirot remained seated, his gaze unblinking, as the chaos unfolded around him. There was no immediate explanation, no obvious reason, but Poirot knew something was off. The pieces didn't add up, and he could feel the mystery unfolding in his mind, the truth just beyond reach. What had happened here? And who among them was responsible? The questions hung in the air, thick with the same unsettling tension that had been building from the start. The wasps, now buzzing around the body, seemed almost a warning, a harbinger of something far darker to come. The night, which had begun with such a gentle calm, had now turned into something unrecognizable, filled with fear and unanswered questions. And as Poirot sat there, unmoving, it was clear that the night was far from over. Something more awaited, something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot's eyes scanned the room, the once tranquil atmosphere now replaced with chaos, he stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, like a conductor preparing to direct the final movement of an unfinished symphony. The guests were frozen, fear seeping into their every glance, but Poirot's gaze remained steady. The wasps, buzzing around the body of O'Rourke, seemed to grow louder, their drone echoing through the silence. The nest had become more than a symbol, it was a warning. Poirot's sharp mind began piecing the scattered clues together, but the truth still eluded him, just out of reach. The night, which had begun so innocently, had now spiraled into a deadly game of deception and silence. And as Poirot turned to face the guests, his voice calm but unyielding, he knew that the murderer was among them. But which one? A final, chilling question hung in the air, unanswered. Who will make the first move? The introduction of characters. The firelight flickered softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the quaint drawing room where the guests had gathered. The warmth of the evening was beginning to fade, but in its place, a certain unease had settled among the group. It was here, in this comfortable yet somehow unsettling space, that Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian detective, made his entrance. He was not a man for grandiose statements, nor for grand entrances. Rather, his presence had a way of asserting itself quietly, almost imperceptibly. His sharp, observant eyes scanned the room with the kind of subtle precision that made one feel as if they were being read like a book, though. To the casual observer, he seemed simply a polite guest, standing slightly apart from the others, his manner always perfectly measured. Poirot's gaze never lingered for long. But in those brief moments, it was as if he absorbed everything, the fluttering of a curtain, the way a guest smiled didn't quite reach their eyes, the faintest flicker of discomfort in Edward's posture. It was the smallest details that Poirot noticed first, details that others missed entirely. The way a woman's hand nervously adjusted her shawl, the tightening of a man's jaw when another spoke. Poirot didn't need words to sense the tension in the room. It was as if the air itself was thick with unspoken truths, waiting to be uncovered. Among the guests, there was Edward, a man who seemed at first glance to be the epitome of quiet, unassuming civility. Tall, with a slight stoop to his shoulders, as though the weight of the world rested upon him, Edward spoke little, preferring to listen. His eyes, however, often wandered around the room, always searching, always watching. Poirot immediately sensed something was off about him. There was a restlessness about Edward, something lurking beneath his calm exterior. His mannerisms, too precise, too deliberate, were the signs of a man who was concealing something, and Poirot's trained eye never missed such a detail. Edward's past, Poirot instinctively knew, was a shadow hanging over him, casting a long and uncomfortable presence over the evening. It was a history that no one spoke of openly, yet all felt its weight. Poirot could see it in the way Edward interacted with the others, the stiff way he held his glass, the way he avoided meeting certain eyes. But it was the interaction with O'Rourke that truly piqued Poirot's curiosity. O'Rourke was a man whose presence could not be ignored. He was the kind of person who commanded attention, not through volume or force, but through sheer charisma. His voice was rich and low, his eyes sharp, and his movements calculated. There was no mistaking the fact that O'Rourke and Edward had a history, a deep, unresolved conflict that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. When they exchanged glances, it was as if the room grew colder, as if the very air between them thickened with unspoken words. The conversation between them was civil, polite even, but Poirot could sense the bitterness beneath the pleasantries. O'Rourke's smile was tight, a forced gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Edward's laugh was too sharp, as though he was trying to hide something. Poirot observed every nuance, every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion. He noted the way O'Rourke's hand lingered on his glass just a little too long after Edward spoke, and how Edward's fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly, every time O'Rourke addressed him. There were others present, of course, the usual gathering of acquaintances and friends, each with their own peculiarities. A well-dressed woman who clutched her pearls too tightly, a young man who seemed more interested in the fire than in the conversation, and an elderly couple whose bickering over trivial matters seemed to mask a deep, unspoken sadness. None of them, however, captured Poirot's attention the way Edward and O'Rourke did. Poirot remained quietly observant, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of a story that had yet to be told. He wasn't yet sure what had transpired between Edward and O'Rourke, but Poirot's instincts told him it was something significant, something that had left a deep scar in the fabric of their relationship. A betrayal, perhaps, a rivalry, maybe even something darker. The evening wore on, and the tension between Edward and O'Rourke only deepened. The other guests were unaware, their chatter filling the space with false cheer, but Poirot could feel the storm brewing in the silence between the two men. And just as the final strained words between Edward and O'Rourke were spoken, a heavy, almost tangible silence fell over the room. The fire crackled louder than ever, its warmth a stark contrast to the coldness that seemed to grip the air. Poirot, still sitting in the corner, steepled his fingers together, watching with a calm, inscrutable expression as the evening reached its inevitable conclusion. He had seen enough. Something was about to break. He could feel it, something that would reveal the truth that was hidden beneath layers of civility, beneath the polite smiles and the carefully chosen words. But what was it, and who among them would be the first to show their hand? The answer, Poirot knew, was just a heartbeat away. Cliffhanger ending. The tension in the room reached its peak, and just as the last words between Edward and O'Rourke hung in the air like a dagger poised to strike, a sudden sound, a thud, broke the silence. Everyone froze, and Poirot's sharp eyes immediately snapped to the source. There on the floor was Edward, his face pale, his hand clutching his chest, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed upon him. The room erupted in chaos, but Poirot remained still, his mind already racing. A second later, O'Rourke stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion, then something else, something darker. Poirot's gaze narrowed. Who was truly guilty here? The questions hung in the air, the answers far from clear. And the night, which had started with such casual ease, now threatened to spiral into something much more sinister. Who would make the first move? The rising tension. As the evening stretched on, the conversation among the guests grew more muted, and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the faces gathered around the table. There was an unsettling quiet that seemed to hang in the air, a silence punctuated only by the crackling of the fire, the clink of glass, and the occasional soft laugh that felt just a little too forced. Hercule Poirot, ever observant, watched the interactions with his usual quiet intensity. His gaze flicked between Edward and O'Rourke, the two men at the center of the subtle storm that was brewing just below the surface. While the other guests carried on with their casual conversations, oblivious to the underlying tension, Poirot's sharp eyes saw what they could not: the tiny signs, the delicate shifts in posture and expression that spoke volumes. He observed the way O'Rourke's smile always seemed to falter when Edward spoke, as if the words stung more than they should. And Edward, though polite, had a stiffness to his smile, a certain tautness in his voice whenever O'Rourke addressed him directly. Edward, the seemingly mild-mannered man who had been introduced with such cordiality, now seemed almost unrecognizable to Poirot. There was a certain tightness in his shoulders, an almost imperceptible clench of his fists that betrayed the calm exterior he tried so hard to maintain. His eyes, those pale, calculating eyes, darted around the room but never quite met O'Rourke's gaze for long. It was as though Edward feared what he might see in that gaze, or perhaps feared what he might reveal. Across the room, O'Rourke, with his commanding presence, carried himself with the assurance of a man who had long been in control. Yet, Poirot caught the flicker of something in his eyes, something that hinted at a past filled with regret, perhaps even guilt. Every time Edward spoke, O'Rourke's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if he was holding back a retort, or perhaps a scornful laugh. But O'Rourke's pride would not allow him to reveal any weakness, so he masked his feelings with a smooth, almost polished veneer. And yet, Poirot could sense the storm that raged behind those careful expressions. The other guests carried on, none of them noticing the silent battle waging between the two men. There was Mrs. Barlow, a woman with a nervous laugh that never quite reached her eyes, trying to fill the growing gap in conversation by discussing the weather. But even she couldn't mask the anxiety that rippled through her every word. Across from her, Mr. Gibbons, the young man who had remained mostly silent up until now, shifted uneasily in his seat, stealing nervous glances at Edward and O'Rourke. It was as if he too could feel the mounting tension, but dared not acknowledge it. Poirot, however, was unfazed by the trivial distractions of the room. His focus remained solely on the two men. The dinner conversation came and went in a blur for him, for while others were wrapped up in the superficial pleasantries of the evening, Poirot's mind was already piecing together the deeper puzzle. He had seen this kind of thing before. He knew the signs, the hesitation in Edward's movements, the clenched jaw when O'Rourke spoke of the past, the subtle shift in the tone of their voices when their words brushed too close to something unsaid, something too painful to confront. It was clear to Poirot that the tension between them wasn't new. This was no minor disagreement, no casual rivalry. What lay beneath the surface was something far more dangerous. A betrayal, perhaps, or a debt too heavy to repay. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he took in the faintest detail Edward's glance, fleeting yet sharp, as O'Rourke made a casual mention of their shared history. A history neither man wanted to revisit, but one that could not be avoided any longer. The evening wore on, but the exchanges grew sharper. Edward's voice, once smooth and controlled, now had an edge to it. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a biting sarcasm in his words, a veiled threat that went unnoticed by most. But not Poirot. He could sense it. O'Rourke, ever the master of composure, took it all in stride yet. Poirot caught the tightening of his fists beneath the table, the way his eyes grew dark for a brief moment, before he smirked and responded with a remark too measured to be kind. The slightest shift in the room seemed to signal the inevitable. Every word spoken between Edward and O'Rourke felt like a carefully constructed layer of tension, a slow, methodical unraveling of the peace that had once existed between them. And Poirot watched it all, noting each subtle flicker of emotion, each carefully chosen word. Poirot's mind began to race. He had seen the signs before. It wasn't a matter of if something would happen, it was a matter of when. There was something about the way the two men danced around one another, speaking in clipped tones, avoiding direct eye contact. Poirot could sense that the evening was nearing its boiling point. He could feel it in the air, the calm before the storm. And just as the clock struck the hour, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor broke the stillness. The two men stood abruptly, their eyes locked in a silent confrontation. It was as though they had both been waiting for this moment, a clash they could no longer avoid. The other guests, momentarily startled, turned their attention to the scene unfolding before them, but Poirot was already ahead of them. His mind, sharp as ever, was already several steps ahead of the game. He watched as Edward and O'Rourke stood face to face, each of them holding their ground. Poirot could sense the tension crackling between them, the years of bitterness and unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. The tension was unbearable. And then it happened. Cliffhanger ending. Just as the silence became unbearable, a loud crack echoed through the room, the sharp sound of something breaking, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the floor. A gasp rang out from the guests, and Poirot's eyes snapped to the source where Edward now lay on the floor, his face pale, his hand clutching his chest. The room erupted into chaos, but Poirot remained calm, his gaze fixed on the scene. O'Rourke was frozen in place, his face a mask of disbelief, or was it something else? Poirot's mind worked furiously, piecing together the puzzle in his mind. Was this a tragic accident? Or had the simmering tension between the two men finally boiled over into violence? The room was filled with questions, but one thing was certain. The truth was still hidden beneath layers of silence, waiting to be uncovered. Who, Poirot wondered, would speak next, and who would remain silent forever? The answer was just out of reach, but one thing was certain: the night was far from over. The clue. The Wasp's Nest. The evening had already begun to take its darker turn when Hercule Poirot found himself stepping outside onto the veranda, away from the heated conversations that had started to boil over inside the house. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the stifling tension within, but even here, in the quiet isolation of the garden, something felt off. Poirot paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the surroundings, as he noticed a small, inconspicuous object sitting on the edge of the windowsill. It was almost as if it had been deliberately placed there, though no one had mentioned it before. A wasp's nest, small but intricately built, nestled against the wooden frame. The delicate craftsmanship of the nest, with its soft grayish-white tones and hollow chambers, seemed completely out of place in this picturesque, peaceful setting. Its presence, however, felt ominous, as though it had been there for a reason, as if it were a silent witness to something yet to unfold. At first, Poirot dismissed it. Just a trivial detail, he thought. Nothing more than nature's way of intruding on the human world. Yet, something about it tugged at the corners of his mind. He stared at it for a moment longer, the subtle buzz of a few late wasps still drifting in the air, reminding him of a distant memory, one of his childhood, when such nests were often used to symbolize a hidden danger, a warning. Inside, the gathering of guests had grown more uncomfortable. The casual conversations had faded, and an unease hung in the air like a storm about to break. Edward and O'Rourke, still standing face to face after their heated exchange, had now been separated, but their eyes still flickered toward one another across the room, filled with something unspoken: fear, anger, something darker. Poirot's sharp mind was never at rest. It darted back to the wasp's nest, an object so seemingly innocent that it would be easy to dismiss. Yet, it stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his awareness. Why had he noticed it? Why had it been there in such a conspicuous spot, almost as if someone had placed it deliberately for him to see? Later that night, Poirot found himself alone again in the garden, a feeling of quiet dread slowly creeping over him. He had excused himself from the house under the guise of needing air, but in truth, he needed a moment to think. There, near the entrance, was the wasp's nest once more. But this time, it was different. The nest had been disturbed. The thin, delicate threads of the nest were visibly torn, and a small portion of the structure seemed to have been forcefully ripped apart. A few wasps buzzed erratically around it, their movements frantic, agitated. It was as though they too were sensing that something was wrong, something had broken the fragile peace of this quiet home. Poirot crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he studied the nest. It was an unsettling sight. His thoughts raced as he considered what could have caused such damage. A curious thought struck him. Had someone intentionally disturbed it? And if so, why? There was a pattern here, one he hadn't fully recognized yet. The wasp's nest wasn't just a random object in the yard. It was a symbol, a clue, placed right in front of him. Something had been hidden here, buried beneath layers of normalcy. A disturbance had occurred, one that no one had yet acknowledged. It was too much of a coincidence for Poirot to ignore. But what was the connection? Who would go to such lengths to destroy something so small, so seemingly insignificant? Was this a sign, a warning, or a message from someone who was already planning their next move? Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Poirot returned to the room, his mind heavy with the thoughts of the wasp's nest and what it might mean. The guests, still uneasy after the earlier confrontation between Edward and O'Rourke, were now beginning to whisper in hushed tones. But Poirot was already far ahead of them, his mind weaving the threads together. Every movement, every glance exchanged, every subtle shift in energy was feeding into his analysis of the situation. As he entered the drawing room, the conversation faltered. Edward looked at him, his eyes narrowed, but Poirot did not return the gaze. Instead, his focus was on the side table, where a small but curious object had been placed, an old weathered book. His fingers brushed against the spine, and an involuntary shiver ran down his back. It was a collection of poems, bound in faded leather. But it was the inscription on the inside cover that sent a cold wave through him. The past never forgets, and it never lets go. The words felt like a chilling echo of the unspoken past, one that Edward and O'Rourke had both tried so hard to bury. Poirot turned the pages carefully, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier with every passing second. And then, in a moment of eerie clarity, Poirot understood. The wasp's nest, the book, the strange tension between the two men, it was all connected. The destruction of the nest was not random. It was a deliberate act, a message from the past that was now rising to the surface. Someone had set a chain of events into motion, one that could not be stopped. Poirot's heart raced. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but something was still missing, something crucial. And it was at that very moment, as the clock struck midnight, that a loud, sharp crack echoed through the room. Everyone turned, startled. The door to the study had swung open, and a figure stood in the doorway, a figure whose face was obscured in shadows. In the stillness of the night, there was no mistaking the cold, calculated expression that now lingered in the air. Poirot's eyes widened in realization. The game was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. The game was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. Cliffhanger ending. The figure stepped forward, and with a slow, deliberate motion reached into the pocket of their coat. What they pulled out was a small, tattered envelope, sealed with a dark red wax. The figure's eyes flicked toward Poirot, and in that brief, silent moment, the tension was unbearable. Poirot's mind raced, but his voice remained steady as he spoke. The truth, it seems, is closer than we think, but who among us is truly ready to face it? The figure's lips curled into a smile that held far too many secrets. And with that, the envelope was placed on the table in front of Poirot, the room frozen in a thick silence. The answer to the mystery was almost within reach, but would Poirot be able to unlock the secrets within before the darkness closed in? The suspenseful confrontation. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the crackling of the fire. The guests, who had once chatted politely, now sat in uneasy silence, their eyes flicking nervously between Edward and O'Rourke. The air had shifted, thickened with a tension that no one could ignore. The room seemed to shrink, each second drawing them closer to something inevitable. Poirot sat back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving the two men. He had been studying them all evening, noting the subtle shifts in body language, the fleeting glances exchanged, the barely perceptible tension that existed beneath their words. He had seen it before the prelude to something terrible, the calm before the storm. But here, tonight, it felt different. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here, coiled tight in the air, waiting to explode. Edward, the usually composed and mild-mannered man, was now visibly agitated. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his drink, the glass clinking against the rim, the sound unnervingly sharp in the tense silence. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting toward O'Rourke, who stood across the room, his posture tense, his expression unreadable, but filled with a simmering resentment. "It's no use, Edward." O'Rourke's voice cut through the silence, low and deliberate. "You can't run from the past forever. It will catch up with you, whether you want it to or not." Edward's eyes flicked to O'Rourke with a flash of anger. "You know nothing about it," he spat, his voice tight. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The conversation was escalating quickly, each word charged with meaning, each exchange of glances like a spark threatening to ignite the dry tinder of the room. The two men, once friends or perhaps allies, or even rivals, now stood at the precipice of something far darker. O'Rourke took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Edward's. "You think you can hide behind this charade, behind your nice house, your perfect life, and pretend everything is fine. But it's not, Edward. It never was." The air grew thicker still. Poirot, who had been silent, let out a small sigh, a faint smile, playing at the corners of his lips as if he was savoring the tension. He knew this moment would come. There was always a point when the truth, buried for too long, came to the surface, and the floodgates opened. But what surprised him was how precisely this moment was unfolding, as if scripted in advance. Edward's breath hitched. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should. His eyes flashed with something dark: fear, guilt, or perhaps both. "I told you," Edward began, his voice shaking slightly. "I told you that night meant nothing. You're twisting it. You don't get it, do you?" O'Rourke's voice was cold now, cutting through the words, almost predatory. "It meant everything. That night changed everything. And now you think you can just walk away from it." Poirot's mind raced. The animosity between these two men was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. But there was something else, something buried in their words, in the way they moved, something Poirot couldn't yet put his finger on, but it gnawed at him. Edward's chest heaved as he took a step back, his gaze shifting toward the door, almost as if he were considering fleeing. But there was nowhere to run. Not here, not tonight. "You don't understand." Edward's voice was a whisper now, desperate. "You never understood what it cost me." O'Rourke stepped forward, his hand clenched into a fist, and in a sudden, violent motion, he slammed his fist against the nearest wooden table, the sharp crack of wood splintering in the tense silence. The room froze. Poirot's eyes widened slightly, but he remained perfectly still. The atmosphere, thick with rage, had escalated to the point of no return. The guests, who had been watching in wide-eyed silence, now instinctively shrank back, fear creeping into their expressions. "I understand more than you think," O'Rourke growled. "And soon everyone else will too." At that moment, the fire in the hearth crackled loudly, its flames suddenly flaring up as if it too were reacting to the volatile energy in the room. Edward flinched, his eyes snapping to the flames, a look of fear flashing across his face. Poirot didn't miss it. It was subtle, but it was there, a momentary crack in the veneer of Edward's calm. What was he afraid of? Was it the past catching up with him, or something more immediate? For a brief moment, the entire room held its breath. Even the house seemed to quiet, the night outside pressing in as the storm that Poirot had sensed all evening began to take shape. And then, just as the silence reached its peak, a soft but unmistakable sound filled the air. The faint buzz of wasps, distant, but growing louder. Everyone turned toward the windowsill, where the wasp's nest had been earlier, only to find it disturbed, hanging by a thread, its contents spilling out like a terrible omen. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked from the nest to Edward, to O'Rourke, to the others in the room. There was no mistake. The wasps were agitated. They were reacting to something, someone. The tension reached its breaking point. Poirot stood up suddenly, his voice calm but heavy with intent. "Gentlemen, please, this conversation is best saved for another time, I think." But it was too late. A scream. It was brief, high-pitched, filled with terror, and then silence. Everyone's eyes snapped toward the source. A figure had collapsed, their body crumpled to the floor, blood staining the carpet beneath them. The wasps, it seemed, were not the only thing disturbed that night. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's eyes locked onto the figure on the floor. The room, once full of breathless anticipation, was now a tomb of silence, broken only by the soft, unsettling hum of the wasps. The identity of the victim was still unclear, but Poirot's mind was already piecing together the details. Something had broken, something irreversible. Someone in this room had crossed a line. He stepped forward, But the door suddenly slammed shut, locking with an eerie finality. The storm outside had begun in earnest, but now the real storm was here, one that Poirot was ready to confront. But who among them had committed the unspeakable act? The answer, it seemed, was closer than anyone could have imagined. The twist, the murder. The night was a symphony of chaos, the kind of chaos that dances on the edge of reason and plunges into madness. Edward, his face pale and ashen, stood frozen in place. His eyes were wide, locked on the still body sprawled on the floor, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. O'Rourke's lifeless form lay in an unnatural pose, the room eerily silent except for the occasional hum of the wasps that seemed to have grown louder, as if mocking the horror of the moment. Poirot stood motionless, his sharp eyes narrowing, calculating. He had seen enough to know that nothing was as it seemed. The wasps had been agitated for a reason, but they were only a symptom. The true cause lay within the walls of the house, buried deep within the hearts of the people present. Edward's trembling hands betrayed him, but Poirot knew that appearances could be deceiving. There was something more at play here, something hidden in plain sight. "Monday due," Edward whispered, his voice raw. "It wasn't me. I didn't do it, Poirot. I swear, I didn't kill him." But Poirot didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the room, observing the smallest details. His gaze flicked from Edward's pale face to the lifeless form of O'Rourke. There was no blood spilt, no visible signs of violence, and yet O'Rourke lay there, deathly still, his expression frozen in a way that suggested shock, as though he hadn't expected it to happen, as though he hadn't seen it coming. It didn't make sense. Edward had been the most obvious suspect. Their animosity was palpable, and the confrontation earlier that evening had been loaded with a tension that now felt like a premonition. But Poirot's instincts told him something was off. Edward wasn't acting like a man guilty of murder. His fear, his confusion, they felt too real. Poirot's mind churned with possibilities as he knelt beside the body, his gloved fingers brushing against the collar of O'Rourke's shirt. He carefully checked the neck, the wrists, and the legs. Nothing. There were no signs of struggle, no injuries, not even a bruise. But as Poirot's eyes narrowed further, he noticed something that immediately sent a ripple of unease through him. The wasp's nest, now barely hanging from the windowsill, had been disturbed, but not just disturbed. It had been completely dislodged, its remnants scattered around O'Rourke's body. A singular wasp hovered near the man's face, its wings buzzing erratically, as though caught in the wake of a storm. And then, in an odd detail, Poirot noticed something that was impossible to ignore. O'Rourke's right hand, the fingers of which were curled tightly as if gripping something invisible. A clue. Poirot straightened, his mind already connecting dots that were invisible to the others. He turned to the other guests, who had been watching in horror, unsure of what to do or say. The silence was thick, suffocating. There were too many questions, too few answers. "I must ask you to leave, all of you," Poirot said, his voice calm but firm. "This scene is far from what it appears." The guests hesitated but obeyed, stepping outside the room one by one, leaving Poirot alone with the body and Edward, who was shaking uncontrollably now. "Poirot," Edward's voice cracked. "You don't believe me, do you? You think I killed him?" Poirot turned his head to Edward, his expression unreadable. "No, Edward, I do not believe you killed him, but I also do not believe you are entirely innocent." Edward's eyes widened, the panic beginning to bubble over. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Poirot took a deep breath, his mind piecing together the clues that had been right before him all along. "Look at the wasps," he murmured. They were disturbed, but O'Rourke, he was not killed by them. He was killed by something much more subtle, more insidious, and yet no one would ever think to look there. Edward's brow furrowed, confusion mingling with his fear. "What are you talking about?" Poirot stood up, his gaze shifting back to O'Rourke's hand. "This," Poirot said, pointing at the hand. "The clenched fingers, they're not just a sign of shock, they're a sign of something more. A last effort, a warning of sorts." Edward swallowed hard, his face pale. Poirot, you're not saying. Poirot's expression softened, a brief flicker of understanding crossing his features. Yes, Edward. What I believe is that O'Rourke was not alone when he died. Someone was here and it wasn't you. The question is, who? There was a long pause, broken only by the distant hum of the Wasp'S, whose buzzing seemed almost louder now. Poirot's thoughts turned inward, as if considering the possibility that the answer was hidden within the very walls of the house, or within the web of lies spun over the years, waiting to be untangled. The game is not yet over, Poirot murmured to himself. Edward, his face pale and twisted with fear, finally spoke, his voice trembling. Poirot, you can't just leave it like this. I'm not guilty, you have to believe me. Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he walked slowly around the body, his sharp mind processing every detail. He was drawing closer to the truth, but there was one last piece to the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. And then, just as Poirot reached out to inspect the wasp's nest once more, something flickered in his peripheral vision, a glint of metal in the dim light, tucked beneath the nearby cabinet. Poirot's fingers grazed the cold, smooth surface of the object, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a small, ornate pocket watch, the same one Edward had been holding earlier in the evening. Edward, Poirot said softly, turning to face the man whose face had turned white with terror. I believe we have found our first clue, and it leads us somewhere none of us are prepared to go. The room seemed to freeze, and the Wasp'S buzzed louder. But the question remained. Who had truly killed O'Rourke, and why? Cliffhanger ending. Poirot held the pocket watch in his hand, his gaze fixed on Edward, whose breath was quickening, his eyes darting nervously. There was something about the way the watch glinted in the dim light, something hidden, something secret. Poirot could feel the threads of the mystery pulling tighter, knotting together in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Edward's fate was about to become entwined with a truth that none of them could have predicted. The game had only just begun, and Poirot was ready to play. The resolution, Poirot's final deduction. The room was stifling, thick with an air of uncertainty. Every second felt like an eternity as Poirot stood there, his back straight, hands clasped behind him. The remaining guests were seated, tense and awaiting the unraveling of the web that had entangled them all. Edward sat on the edge of his chair, his eyes never leaving Poirot's face. His lips quivered, but he remained silent, the weight of suspicion heavy on his chest. Poirot's piercing gaze swept across the room, settling on each person present, his mind calculating, sorting through the layers of deception, lies, and hidden truths. He had the answer now, but how to reveal it, how to break the illusion that had so carefully been constructed. Poirot finally spoke, his voice calm but with an underlying firmness that commanded attention. Mes amis, allow me to explain how this was done. The room went quiet. Edward's breathing grew heavier, more labored, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. His eyes flickered to the pocket watch Poirot still held, and the tension in the air seemed to double. There was something in the way Poirot was looking at it that made Edward's pulse race. It was as if he knew something that hadn't been said yet. Poirot took a deep breath and began. The crime that occurred in this house was not as simple as it seemed. No, it was the culmination of years of silence, years of hidden motives, and, yes, years of unspoken resentment. He paused, his gaze sweeping back to Edward, whose face had gone ashen. Poirot continued. It was not just a murder of passion, nor an act of sudden violence. It was a carefully planned execution of a long-standing grudge, a confrontation that had been brewing beneath the surface for far too long. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his hand shaking. Poirot, you don't understand. I didn't. Poirot held up a hand to silence him. I understand more than you think, Edward. You see, I have watched you. I have observed your every move, your every glance. You were trying to hide something, trying to protect yourself from a truth that was too painful to confront. The room hung in a tense silence, everyone watching Poirot, waiting for the inevitable revelation. He turned towards the other guests, his gaze cutting through the quiet tension. But you, Edward, you were not the only one hiding a secret. You were hiding it from all of us, but most of all from yourself. From all of us, but most of all from yourself. Poirot's eyes locked onto the man sitting across the room. O'Rourke, the man who had known you for years, the man you thought you had buried in the past, he was the key to everything. A gasp swept through the room. Edward's face turned a shade paler. You see, Poirot continued, O'Rourke was no stranger to the darkness of your past. He had seen you, Edward, when you were a different man, when your life was one of deceit and betrayal. You thought you could escape it. You thought you could bury it. But O'Rourke never forgot. Edward's eyes widened in horror as Poirot's words hit him like a hammer. What are you saying? His voice was barely a whisper. Poirot's voice was steady, resolute. I am saying that O'Rourke knew the truth about you. He knew your deepest secret, the one you had buried so carefully, the secret that had shaped the very man you are today. O'Rourke had been waiting, watching for the right moment to expose you, to reveal your sins. Edward's breath caught in his throat, his face contorting in a mixture of fear and guilt. No, you're wrong, Poirot. I never. Poirot didn't let him finish. He raised a hand to silence him once more. It is not just your past that I speak of, Edward. It is your present. It is your actions today that reveal the truth. When O'Rourke confronted you, he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated you. The room seemed to shrink around Edward as Poirot stepped forward, his eyes never leaving his. You killed him, Edward, but you didn't do it out of anger, as you might have hoped. Number 7. You killed him because you were afraid. Afraid that your past would be exposed, that your carefully constructed life would crumble before your eyes. Edward's face was twisted in a mix of rage and despair. He jumped to his feet, his hands trembling, his body stiff with tension. No, I didn't. Poirot's voice cut through him like a knife. Yes, you did. The murder was not just a desperate act of self-preservation. It was a confession. You murdered him because you could not bear the truth of your own actions. You murdered him because he knew who you truly were. The room was still, the silence almost deafening as Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Edward was frozen, unable to move or speak, his eyes wild with a mix of disbelief and regret. Poirot took a slow step back, his gaze turning to the rest of the room. But there is more to this story, my friends. The Wasp'S, the pocket watch, they were all part of the puzzle. Edward's actions were calculated, but they were not without a motive. He had prepared for this moment. He had prepared for the confrontation. But what he did not expect was that O'Rourke had already planned to reveal everything. Poirot's final words hung in the air like a storm about to break. The truth, mes amis, is not always what it seems, and Edward's guilt is not the only truth that remains. The question is, who else in this room was complicit in the cover-up? As Poirot's words settled into the minds of everyone present, a tense, electric silence filled the room. There was something more, something darker hiding beneath the surface, a truth that no one could yet grasp. The mystery was far from over. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's eyes locked onto the faces of the guests, his voice low and filled with an eerie calm. You see, Edward was not alone in this. Someone else helped him cover his tracks. Someone else was complicit. And now, the question is, who else in this house has blood on their hands? Edward's face went pale. He trembled as he backed away from Poirot, his eyes darting around the room in panic. Poirot's gaze swept the room one final time, settling on each person as if weighing their every word, their every movement. The storm was far from over, and the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place.